The knife sliced cleanly through the roasted chicken, the soft scrape of metal against porcelain filling the brief pauses in conversation, the kind of familiar domestic sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt strangely loud, as if amplifying the undercurrents of something unspoken. My husband sat at the head of the table, his presence solid, dependable, steady as ever, his voice effortlessly weaving through topics. Work updates, market trends, the neighbor's new car, while I nodded along playing my part but barely absorbing a word. Across from me, his younger half-brother lounged in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his expression composed but eyes sharp, watching, always watching in a way that made the air feel heavier than it should. The room was warmly lit, the wine in our glasses catching the glow of the chandelier overhead, casting long shadows across the tablecloth, a scene that could have been painted as picture-perfect, yet beneath it something shifted, something almost imperceptible but undeniably there. My husband laughed at something, his deep voice filling the space, oblivious to the way his younger brother's gaze drifted back to me, measured, deliberate, lingering just a second too long before flicking away like it hadn't happened at all. I forced myself to look at my plate, cutting my food into neat, unnecessary pieces, trying to ignore the way my pulse seemed to tick a little faster beneath my skin. "You've got great taste," the younger brother mused, swirling his wine before taking a slow sip, his words directed toward no one in particular, but landing somewhere between the lines of the conversation, meant for me even if they weren't addressed to me. I glanced up, feigning indifference, but he was already watching, his expression unreadable, something between amusement and curiosity playing at the corners of his mouth, as if daring me to react. Dinner stretched on, the rhythm of clinking silverware and muffled conversation filling the space where my thoughts should have been but weren't. I found myself hyper-aware of everything, every accidental brush of his hand against the tablecloth, the way his fingers drummed idly against his glass, the faint smirk that appeared whenever he caught me looking, as if he knew something I didn't, or maybe something I wasn't willing to admit. By the time I stood to clear the dishes, my hands felt unsteady, though I told myself it was just the wine. The water ran hot as I scrubbed at the plates, the sound of footsteps behind me barely registering until he was there, too close, his presence cutting through the air like a silent question. "You always do that," he said, voice lower now, quieter, like a conversation not meant to be overheard. I stiffened but didn't turn. "Do what?" My fingers tightened around the sponge, the heat of the water creeping up my wrists. "Bite your cheek when you're thinking," he mused, his tone laced with something knowing, something that made my stomach clench involuntarily. I swallowed, focusing on the soap suds swirling down the drain, willing my voice to stay even. "I didn't realize." He hummed, a small sound of acknowledgement, before his fingers brushed my wrist, light, fleeting but unmistakably intentional. "Nice nails," he observed, and before I could pull away he took my hand, tilting it slightly, studying the way the dim light caught the glossy sheen of polish. "Looks expensive." "Not really," I managed, though my breath had gone shallow, though my skin felt suddenly too tight, too warm. The moment stretched, charged with something unspoken, something dangerous, and then a door creaked upstairs, the unmistakable sound of my husband moving about. My heart slammed against my ribs as I yanked my hand back, pressing my palm against the damp counter as if that could erase what had just happened. The younger brother didn't react, didn't startle, didn't even step away. Instead, he lingered for a second longer, lips twitching in what might have been amusement. "Enjoy your night," he murmured, and then he was gone, his retreating footsteps fading into the low hum of the house, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the pounding of my own heartbeat. By the time my husband appeared in the doorway, adjusting his watch, his expression unreadable, I had already buried my hands back in the soapy water, desperate for something to do, something to anchor me back into normalcy. "You okay?" he asked, his voice light, casual, unsuspecting. I forced a smile, ignoring the warmth still lingering on my skin. "Yeah," I lied. "Everything's fine." The pounding of a hammer echoed through the house, rhythmic, steady, blending with the scent of sawdust and fresh paint that clung to the air. The renovation had been my husband's idea, a project to freshen things up, though I suspected it was less about home improvement and more about control. His way of maintaining order, keeping everything in its place just as it should be. His younger brother had offered to help, or maybe my husband had insisted. Either way, he was here almost daily now, moving through the house with an ease that made it feel less and less like my space and more like something we were sharing, something unspoken settling into the walls along with the new fixtures and fresh coats of paint. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was temporary, that soon the floors would be polished, the dust would clear and life would go back to normal, but normal already felt like something slipping further out of reach. I found him in the hallway one afternoon, his back turned to me, shoulders bare, muscles shifting beneath tanned skin as he adjusted a panel against the wall. The heat of the day seeped through the open window, the air thick and still, the only sound the low scrape of sandpaper against wood. He hadn't noticed me yet, and I should have left, should have turned around and walked away before he did, but I didn't. I lingered, watching, something twisting low in my stomach, something dangerous. Then he glanced over his shoulder, and I knew, by the way his mouth curved into that slow, knowing smirk, that he had felt my stare before he had seen it. Need something? His voice was easy, casual, but there was something else beneath it, something teasing, as if we were already playing a game I hadn't agreed to but somehow found myself in. I forced a breath, willed my expression into something neutral, something indifferent. Just checking on the progress. He turned fully then, the muscles in his arms flexing as he leaned against the unfinished wall, a small streak of paint smudged near his collarbone, the kind of small imperfection that felt too intimate to notice, too careless to ignore. You really care about this renovation, or are you just finding excuses to watch me work? The words caught me off guard, sharp and deliberate, a challenge wrapped in amusement, and I hated how quickly my pulse reacted, how I felt heat creep up my neck before I could stop it. You think a lot of yourself. I shot back, but it didn't land the way I wanted it to, didn't sound convincing enough, not even to myself. He tilted his head, studying me, as if peeling back the layers of something I hadn't even realized I was trying to hide. You didn't answer my question, he said, voice softer now, but not any less dangerous. I frowned, shifting my weight, suddenly aware of how narrow the hallway felt, of how the space between us was nothing more than a single step. What question? His gaze didn't waver, didn't flinch, didn't let me escape. Are you happy? It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, quiet but firm, as if he already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to say it out loud. Something cold settled in my chest, something too real, too close to the truth, and I hated that he had been the one to ask, that he had been the one to make me think about it in a way I had been avoiding for years. My throat felt tight, my tongue heavy, but no words came. I couldn't say yes. I couldn't say no. So I said nothing at all. The silence stretched, thick and charged, his expression unreadable, my own probably too transparent. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. He exhaled, pushed off the wall, grabbed his shirt from where it had been draped over the banister, and pulled it on with a slow, deliberate ease, like he was giving me time to look away but knowing I wouldn't. See you at dinner, he murmured, and then he was gone, disappearing down the hall, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, skin too warm, fingers curled into my palms. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, his steady breathing filling the quiet, I closed my eyes and tried to think of anything else. I tried to focus on the feel of my husband's arm resting loosely around my waist, on the familiar weight of him beside me, on the life we had built together, solid and predictable, exactly as it should be. But all I could hear was a voice in the back of my mind, low and insistent, asking me a question I still didn't have an answer to. The house felt different when I was alone, the silence heavier, the walls seeming to hold on to the echoes of conversations that had long faded. My husband had left early that morning, suitcase in hand, a distracted kiss pressed to my forehead before he disappeared through the front door, already absorbed in the calls and emails waiting for him. I told myself the quiet was a relief, a moment to breathe, to reset, to pull myself back into the version of myself I recognized, but the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I moved through the house aimlessly, straightening things that didn't need straightening, checking my phone without reason, pacing as if movement could somehow shake the restless energy out of my bones. The knock at the door came mid-afternoon, sharp and unexpected, a sound that sent a pulse of something I didn't want to name straight through me. I already knew who it was before I opened it. He stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe, his presence as effortless as always, as if he belonged here, as if this was something ordinary. Just checking in, he said, voice smooth, easy, carrying that same quiet amusement that always made me feel like he was 2 steps ahead of me in a game I hadn't agreed to play. I hesitated for half a second too long before stepping back, letting him inside, telling myself it was nothing, that there was no reason not to. He moved through the space with familiarity, glancing around as if looking for signs of something, his gaze settling on the half-empty cup of coffee I had abandoned on the counter. "Enjoying your day off?" he asked, reaching for the mug, lifting it slightly as if testing its weight. I forced a smile, crossing my arms over my chest. Trying to. Feels quiet without him here. Something flickered in his eyes at that, something unreadable, and then he set the cup down, stepping closer, not enough to be inappropriate but enough that I felt it. "You don't like quiet?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, the air between us too thick. "Sometimes." A small pause, his head tilting slightly, studying me like he was peeling back layers I hadn't meant to reveal. "You know," he said finally, voice lower now, steadier, like a confession slipping free, "I've always admired you." I blinked, caught off guard, my pulse skipping before I could catch it. "What?" He didn't flinch, didn't waver, his gaze locked onto mine, unrelenting. "You pretend you don't notice, but you do. And I know you feel it too." My breath caught in my throat, a warning siren blaring in the back of my mind, but my feet stayed planted, my body frozen in place as he took another step forward, closing the distance between us until there were only inches, only a breath of space separating us. My heart pounded, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to say something, to break whatever this was before it became something else. But then my phone rang, loud and sharp, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. I sucked in a breath and turned away too quickly, fumbling for the device as if it were a lifeline, barely registering the name flashing across the screen before I answered. My husband's voice filled the silence, calm, unsuspecting, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling inside me. "Hey, just checking in. How's your day going?" I struggled to steady my voice, to push the tremor out of it, forcing normalcy into words that didn't feel real. "Good. Quiet. How's the trip?" I felt him still behind me, too close, unmoving, watching. My husband spoke, his words barely registering as I nodded along, answering on autopilot, hyper-aware of every second, every inhale, every inch of space between me and the man standing in my kitchen. My hand clenched around the phone, nails digging into my palm as I forced out a small laugh at something my husband said, but it came out thin, weak, not quite right. The call ended with the usual goodbye, the promise to talk later, and then I lowered the phone, pressing it to the counter as I exhaled shakily, my fingers still trembling slightly. I barely had time to turn before he moved, swift, deliberate, closing the final gap between us before I could react, before I could think, before I could stop it. His hand came up, fingers ghosting over my jaw, tilting my chin up just enough, his breath warm against my skin for a fraction of a second before his lips were on mine. The shock hit first, a sharp jolt that left me momentarily paralyzed, my body caught between instinct and something else, something far more dangerous. His touch was firm but unhurried, testing, waiting, as if giving me the chance to pull away. And then I did. I jerked back, breathless, heart slamming against my ribs, my mind a tangle of panic and disbelief. His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't apologize, didn't look regretful, only studied me in that same infuriating way, like he had just confirmed something he had already known. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I spun on my heel, moving before I had time to process, my feet carrying me out of the kitchen, down the hall, into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me with too much force. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the cool wood, my breath coming too fast, my thoughts spiraling into something I didn't want to name. I had to stop this. I had to stop it now. I moved through the day as if nothing had happened, forcing normalcy into my routine, into the way I carried myself, into every breath, every step, every meaningless task that should have felt natural but suddenly didn't. I washed dishes that didn't need washing, folded laundry that had already been neatly stacked, reorganized drawers I hadn't opened in weeks. Anything to keep my hands busy, anything to keep my mind from circling back to the way his lips had felt against mine, the way my body had betrayed me in that split second before I pulled away. The house felt different, like it had absorbed the weight of what had happened, like it knew, like it could see right through me no matter how hard I tried to act like nothing had changed. He didn't text, didn't call, didn't show up unannounced, but I felt him everywhere, a phantom presence lingering in every room, in the silence, in the space between thoughts, in the way I jumped every time my phone buzzed even though I knew it wouldn't be him. When I finally saw him again, it was almost unbearable how normal he seemed, how effortlessly he walked into my kitchen with that same easy confidence, joking with my husband, reaching for a glass of water as if everything was the same, as if he hadn't shattered something inside me. His eyes met mine briefly, just a flicker of recognition, nothing overt, nothing anyone else would catch, but I felt it like a hand around my throat, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet declaration that he knew that I knew that something irreversible had shifted between us. I should have left the room, should have excused myself, should have put as much distance between us as possible, but I stayed rooted in place, pretending to be absorbed in wiping down the already spotless counter, pretending not to notice the way my fingers trembled slightly against the cloth. He didn't say anything, didn't push, but there was something new in his posture, in the way he carried himself, a certainty, a quiet triumph, like a man who had tested a boundary and found it weaker than expected. My husband was oblivious, laughing at something, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the slow, quiet unraveling happening just beneath the surface of our home. By the time evening rolled around, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, my mind frayed from the constant battle of suppressing, denying, pretending. My husband noticed, his brow furrowing slightly as I absent-mindedly pushed my food around my plate, my responses to his conversation growing shorter, more distracted. "You okay?" he asked, voice light but laced with something else, something cautious, something curious. "Just tired," I answered, too quickly, too flatly, forcing a small smile that didn't reach my eyes, waiting for him to let it go. He studied me for a beat longer than necessary, his gaze sharp, assessing as if he could sense something wasn't right, as if he could feel the shift in me even if he couldn't place it. But then he nodded, accepting my excuse, and I felt both relief and guilt slam into me at the same time, the weight of my deception pressing harder against my ribs. Later that night, long after my husband had fallen asleep, I slipped out onto the balcony, the cool night air hitting my skin like a slap, sharp and grounding, clearing the fog in my head just enough to let me breathe. The city stretched out before me, lights flickering in the distance, the world moving on as if my own hadn't just tilted off its axis. I gripped the railing, inhaled deeply, told myself this was it, this was the moment I reset, the moment I took control of myself again. And then I heard him. His voice was quiet, close, coming from the shadowed walkway below, just out of sight but unmistakable. "You wanted it too." The words sliced through me, unraveling every fragile thread I had spent the whole day trying to hold together. I didn't turn, didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, breath held, heart hammering as the truth settled into my bones, as I realized that no matter how much I lied to myself, no matter how hard I tried to bury it, he was right. The restaurant was dimly lit, the golden glow of candlelight flickering against the polished wood of the table, casting soft shadows across the crisp white linen. The scent of roasted garlic and simmering wine hung in the air, rich and warm, the quiet hum of conversation blending with the low, soothing notes of a jazz tune floating through the speakers. It should have felt intimate, should have felt like a moment worth savoring, but my skin prickled with something restless, something uneasy, something I didn't want to name. My husband sat across from me, his eyes soft but searching, watching me in that way he did when he was trying to figure something out, when he knew something had shifted but couldn't quite grasp what. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said, his voice steady, measured, not accusatory, just observant. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing over mine, the touch familiar, grounding, safe. "I thought we could use a night just for us." I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat, forcing a smile that I prayed looked convincing, though the doubt in his gaze told me it wasn't. "I'm glad you planned this," I murmured, lifting my wine glass, taking a sip, letting the warmth slide down my throat as if it could settle the storm brewing inside me. We talked about the past, about when we first met, about the years that had felt so full, so effortless, when laughter had been easy and touch had been second nature. He recounted a trip we took early in our marriage, a story he had told a dozen times before, but tonight his voice was softer, almost nostalgic, as if he was trying to pull me back to who we used to be. I laughed at the right moments, nodded in the right places, but it felt mechanical, rehearsed, like I was watching myself from the outside, playing the role of the woman I was supposed to be. Dinner passed slowly, each moment stretching, each smile feeling like something I had to hold in place, each glance across the table met with a quiet patience I didn't deserve. By the time we stepped outside, the night air was crisp, cool against my flushed skin, and my husband's hand found the small of my back, his touch light but deliberate, his thumb brushing absent-minded circles against my dress. It had been a long time since he touched me like that, since he looked at me like that, since his presence felt like something I should want. Back at home, the house was quiet, the city sounds muffled beyond the windows, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the space between us. He turned to me in the dim light of the hallway, his hands resting gently on my waist, his gaze searching, waiting as if giving me the chance to step back, to pull away. I didn't. I let him kiss me. His lips were soft, warm, patient, moving with the familiarity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, who knew every tilt of my head, every sigh, every rhythm. I let myself lean into it, let myself pretend for just a moment that this was enough, that this was what I needed, that this was what I wanted. But when his arms wrapped around me, when his warmth pressed closer, when I closed my eyes and let myself drift into the space between thought and sensation, the image that formed in the darkness behind my eyelids wasn't his. It was his younger brother. My stomach twisted, my breath caught in my throat, a sharp jolt of panic lacing through me as I stiffened against my husband's embrace, the weight of my own betrayal hitting me like a punch to the chest. I pulled back too quickly, too abruptly, my hands shaking as I stepped out of his grasp, offering a forced, quiet murmur about being tired, about needing rest, about anything that could explain the sudden tremor in my voice. He hesitated, his brows furrowing slightly, but he didn't push, just pressed a kiss to my temple before watching me retreat down the hall, his gaze heavy on my back, thick with something unspoken. I closed the bedroom door behind me, pressing my fingers to my lips, my heartbeat erratic, my mind racing with the undeniable truth that I had crossed a line, that I had already lost control, that even if nothing had happened, something inside me had already snapped. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where people came to work, to read, to escape into the background noise of clinking cups and muffled conversations. The smell of freshly ground coffee lingered in the air, rich and warm, blending with the low hum of jazz playing through the speakers. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I had just needed a change of scenery, a moment alone, that I hadn't noticed his car parked outside when I walked in. But when I saw him sitting at the corner table, one arm draped lazily over the back of his chair, a slow, knowing smile curling at the edge of his lips as our eyes met, I knew I was lying to myself. I could have walked away, could have turned around and left before he had the chance to say anything, but my feet kept moving, carrying me toward him as if the choice had never been mine to begin with. He didn't look surprised, didn't look like someone who had just happened to be in the same place at the same time. He looked like he had been waiting. "Didn't take you for a coffee shop person," he said as I slid into the chair across from him, my hands wrapping tightly around the warmth of the ceramic mug, as if grounding myself could somehow erase the tension tightening in my chest. "Didn't take you for one either," I said, keeping my voice light, casual, pretending that this was nothing, that my pulse wasn't thrumming too fast beneath my skin. His lips twitched, amusement flickering in his gaze as he leaned back, studying me in that quiet, deliberate way that always made me feel like he saw too much. "Maybe we don't know each other as well as we think." I forced a small laugh, shaking my head, willing my body to relax, forcing normalcy into the space between us. "We've known each other for years," I said, lifting my cup, taking a slow sip, letting the heat burn against my lips, anything to keep my focus steady. He tilted his head, still watching, still waiting, and then, as if deciding he had given me enough time to play pretend, he leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, voice low but firm. "We can lie to whoever we want," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine, unblinking, unwavering. "But we can't lie to ourselves." My breath hitched, my fingers tightening around the cup, a sharp, instinctual reaction I couldn't suppress. A nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it, too quick, too thin, my shoulders tensing as I shook my head, tried to dismiss it, tried to push it away. "You always were dramatic," I said, my voice forced, airy, like a joke that didn't land. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't break eye contact, just watched, just waited, just let the weight of his words settle between us like something inevitable. I swallowed hard, my pulse a steady drumbeat in my ears, my mind screaming at me to leave, to walk away, to end this before I let it become something I couldn't undo. But I didn't move. Later, driving home, my hands gripped the wheel too tightly, my breathing shallow, my thoughts spiraling as my phone buzzed beside me. A single message. "You know where to find me." The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made my own thoughts unbearable, every room feeling too big, too empty, too filled with something unspoken. My husband was gone for the day, an early morning departure with a quick goodbye, a distracted kiss, a promise to be home late. I should have spent the day running errands, should have buried myself in work, should have done anything but what I was about to do. But my hands were already gripping the keys, my body already moving toward the door, my mind feeding me every excuse I needed to justify what I knew deep down was a mistake I wouldn't be able to take back. I told myself it was practical, told myself it was harmless, told myself it made sense to ask for his help. There were things around the house that needed fixing, things my husband had put off for weeks, things that, logically, his younger brother could handle. It was a good enough excuse, one I could repeat in my head as I knocked on his door, as I heard his footsteps approaching, as I forced myself to breathe evenly when he opened it, leaning lazily against the frame, shirt hanging loose, sleeves pushed up as if he had been expecting me all along. His eyes flickered with amusement, but he didn't say anything right away, just let the silence stretch. Just let the moment sink in before tilting his head slightly, voice smooth, easy. Didn't think I'd see you today. I cleared my throat, gripping my purse tighter than necessary, ignoring the way my pulse skipped in response. I need some help with something at the house, I said, keeping my tone casual, keeping my words light as if this was normal, as if this was nothing. He didn't answer right away, just studied me, just let his gaze linger long enough that I felt it, that I knew he wasn't buying my excuse, that I knew we both understood what this was. Then finally a small smirk tugged at his lips, his head nodding slightly as he stepped aside, motioning for me to come in instead. I hesitated just for a second, just long enough to consider turning around, but then I was stepping forward, crossing the threshold, feeling the door click shut behind me, sealing us in. The air was thick, heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name, something unspoken but not unnoticed. The words we exchanged were nothing. Small talk, surface-level conversation, questions about what needed fixing, about what had been broken. But none of it mattered, not really. Because the way he looked at me wasn't casual. The way I fidgeted under his gaze wasn't subtle. And the way we moved through the space, careful but inevitable, wasn't accidental. I didn't realize how close we had gotten until I turned and nearly collided with him, until I felt the heat of his skin too near mine, until I heard the way my breath hitched, unsteady, giving me away. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The space between us was already gone. The choice had already been made. I should have stepped back. I should have said something. But I didn't. And neither did he. By the time I made it home, my hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my heart beat an erratic rhythm against my ribs, my mind looping the same question over and over again. What now? The night was thick with summer heat, the kind that made the air feel heavy, pressing against my skin, making every breath feel slower, deeper, like the world had stretched itself into something sluggish and inevitable. The house was dimly lit, the warm glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, the low hum of distant conversation fading into the background, meaningless noise against the storm building inside me. I didn't know if I had been waiting for him or if he had been waiting for me, but when I turned the corner and found him standing there, leaning against the counter, a glass loosely gripped in his fingers, I knew this wasn't chance. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. His gaze met mine, steady, unwavering, the weight of it enough to pull me closer, enough to make my breath falter, enough to remind me that we had already crossed the line, that there was no point in pretending otherwise. Every step I took felt deliberate, my heart beat a sharp, erratic rhythm against my ribs, my skin buzzing with the awareness of what had happened, of what couldn't be undone. He didn't move right away, just watched, just waited, his expression unreadable but knowing, as if daring me to deny it, as if he already knew I wouldn't. The space between us vanished in slow increments, in the way he tilted his head slightly, in the way his fingers flexed against the glass, in the way my own breath hitched when he leaned in just enough, just barely, his voice low, quiet, a whisper against the charged silence. "You keep ending up here," he murmured, and he was right, and I hated that he was right, and I hated that I didn't care. I should have stepped back. I should have left the room. But I didn't. And then I felt it. A shift. A presence. A sudden weight in the air, colder, sharper, something that sent a slow, creeping dread curling around my spine. I turned, pulse slamming against my ribs, stomach twisting before I even saw him, before I even registered the way he stood in the doorway, silent, unmoving, watching. My husband. His expression wasn't anger. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even pain. It was something worse. It was knowing. It was certainty. It was cold. My throat went dry, my body locking in place, my mind scrambling for something, anything, any excuse, any justification, any way to undo the last few seconds, the last few days, the last few weeks. But there was nothing. He knew. He had seen. And he said nothing. The silence stretched, unbearable, suffocating, the space between us widening and collapsing all at once, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like a sentence already passed. He didn't ask. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand an explanation. He just stood there. And somehow, that was worse than if he had yelled, worse than if he had broken something, worse than if he had walked away. Because now there was nothing left to say. The silence was the worst part, heavy and deliberate, wrapping around me like a noose that tightened with every passing hour. My husband didn't ask questions, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand explanations. He just watched. At dinner, his gaze lingered a little too long when I set his plate down, his expression unreadable, his fingers drumming absently against the edge of the table, slow and rhythmic, like he was counting something I couldn't see. At night he lay beside me in bed, his breathing steady, even controlled, but I could feel the tension radiating from his body, could feel the weight of his awareness pressing into the space between us. I waited for an outburst, for anger, for confrontation, but it never came. He let the silence do the work for him. It should have been a relief. It should have given me time to think, to come up with something, to figure out how to fix what had already shattered. But instead, it left me drowning in my own thoughts, every second stretching into something unbearable. I told myself that guilt was the reason I couldn't sleep, that it was the reason my stomach twisted every time he looked at me, but deep down I knew it wasn't just that. It was the knowledge that I had gone too far, that this wasn't something I could rewind, that no matter how much I wanted to pretend, there was no version of this where things went back to the way they had been before. I tried to act normal, tried to move through the day as if nothing had changed, but it was useless. Every moment felt too loud, too sharp, too exposed. My hands trembled when I poured coffee in the morning, my voice wavered when I spoke, my body betrayed me in 100 small ways I couldn't control. My husband noticed. Of course he noticed. But he still didn't say a word. And then one night he did. It was late, the house quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator. I had been staring at my book for 20 minutes, the words blurring together, unread, forgotten. My husband stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching me for a moment before he finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, almost too careful. "Would you want to start over?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach, unexpected, sharp, knocking the air from my lungs. I looked up, searching his face for something, hope, regret, anger, but there was nothing there. Just quiet patience. Just waiting. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't know what the right answer was. I didn't know what he wanted me to say. And worst of all, I didn't know what I wanted. So I said nothing. The suitcase sat by the door, half-zipped, clothes folded with an efficiency that made my stomach twist. He moved through the house like a man already gone, not slamming doors, not breaking things, not raising his voice. Just packing. Just leaving. There was no fight, no final plea, no desperate attempt to salvage what had already rotted from the inside out. He had made his decision and now I had to live with it. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, nails digging into my palms, watching as he pulled a shirt from the closet and laid it neatly on top of the rest of his things. My throat felt tight, raw, like I had swallowed something sharp. I wanted to say something, to reach for the right words, but there was nothing left that hadn't already been destroyed. He zipped the suitcase, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. "I can't stay here," he said finally, his voice calm, final, the kind of certainty that didn't leave room for argument. "Not in this house." I swallowed hard, my chest aching, but I knew there was no point in fighting it. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't looking for an explanation. He was simply done. I had spent days waiting for this moment, bracing for the inevitable, convincing myself that I would be prepared when it came. I wasn't. He picked up his bag, glancing around one last time as if trying to decide if he had forgotten anything, as if he were taking in the life he was walking away from. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, and for a brief second I thought maybe he would say something else. Maybe he would ask if I regretted it. Maybe he would give me a chance to say that I did. But he didn't. He just nodded, just barely, before turning toward the door. And then he was gone. The house felt cavernous without him, too big, too empty, as if the walls had absorbed the weight of his absence, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what had been. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where he had been, the quiet pressing in on me like something alive. And then finally I moved. I didn't know where I was going until I was already there, standing at the window looking out at the street below. His car pulled away, taillights glowing red against the dark pavement, shrinking into the distance until they disappeared completely. He hadn't looked back. Neither did his brother. He had left earlier, no suitcase, no goodbyes, no dramatic declarations. Just gone. As if none of it had ever mattered. As if I had never mattered. He hadn't asked what I would do next. He hadn't asked if I wanted to see him again. He hadn't even given me the illusion of choice. The realization settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I had lost them both. Later, much later, when the house was completely still, when the night stretched long and restless, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, the reflection staring back at me eerily unfamiliar. My fingers traced the edges of the sink, my breath slow, measured, forced. And then, barely a whisper, a question I wasn't sure I wanted the answer to. Was it worth it? The silence was the only response.